Hello, everyone. I am Melissa Forziat. I'm a keynote speaker and the host of this Daisy Jones and the Six Rewatch podcast. When I speak, my topic is something I call Take the Doughnut. It's another way to say Carpe Diem, and it's all about going after the things you want in life. And something that I wanted to do this year was rewatch the show Daisy Jones and the Six and talk about it with other people. So here we are. All of you are here. And I also have a special guest for today because we're going to do an interview. And I just wanted to give everybody a heads up that this is going to be I'm sure, a spoiler, very heavy interview. So if you have not seen all of Daisy Jones and the Six, go back and watch it and then come back to this interview because I think you'll get a lot more out of it that way. But without further ado, I'm very excited to welcome my guest for today, who is Jeff Cutter, who's the director of photography for episodes 6, 8, 9, and 10 for this show. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you.
I'm so excited to talk with you. There's a lot of technical things I want to talk to you about here in this show, but let's start a little more broadly first. And just how did you get connected with this show to begin with?
Well, the director and Zinga Stewart and I go way back. We had done music videos back in the sort of late 90s and early 2000s when music videos were like kind of a much bigger deal and you actually got to sort of really take chances and experiment, and it was a really sort of fun time. So we had done music videos together. I sort of started, shooting films and TV in sort of the mid 2000s, and then Zika started directing a lot of projects. And she had reached out to me several times on a few different projects to try to get reconnected, but it hadn't worked out. And then the timing of this one worked out, and she reached out back in probably would have been the fall of 21. And I was very sort of excited by the period aspect of it. And that was the thing that really sort of sucked me in, was like this sex, drugs, and rock and roll in the 70s.
And I guess it's not, I mean, it's certainly not a music video, but I imagine you could use a lot of the skills that you had from that world to bring them directly into this.
I think to an extent, yes, although I would actually say that I could, I've used a lot of those music video skills through all the projects I've worked on. I think there are things you learn. Um, I think the thing that was sort of really interesting in our initial conversations, and the things that also the showrunners and, because when we sort of came in and I mean, Nzinga had pitched her stuff, but I also had to go in and talk to them and talk to the producers and the showrunners. Um, but we had the one thing that sort of kept coming up was that nobody wanted this to be a concert film. Like, it wasn't like we want to be observational and standing back for all of these, performances that were going on particularly in our episodes, as the show progresses. So it was, while there were lots of things that, yes, we could definitely have mined from our Daisy music videos, it was also important to kind of be careful not to like fall into that sort of like, oh, we're making a music video. We got to make sure that really the core of it is this emotional journey that all these characters are on. And the music was, that happened to be just a fantastic sort of like visual and audio kind of backdrop to the whole thing.
Hmm. So, okay, for those who don't know the industry very well, as the director of photography for this show and for these episodes, what does your job entail?
I mean, in a sort of very broad strokes, like top down view, it's like essentially the lighting and the camera work. Now, I don't actually operate the camera. There's usually camera operators, sort of depends on the scale of the job. So it's more about designing shots, which you always do in conjunction with the director. So it's breaking down the scenes and saying what are like, 'cause, the photography, all those choices you make with the camera. Does it move? Does it not move? Is it handheld? Are you on a wide lens up close? Are you on a long lens further away? All those things impact how an audience, feels about a scene or receives that. So it's just you make all those choices based on a scene, and that's always done, with the director. You're not doing it on your own. You're sort of discussing the scenes, breaking them down, and then you're saying, oh, well, this scene, the characters are really on edge. It should be handheld. Maybe it's even one long take to really emphasize. So there's that aspect of it, and then the other side is the sort of lighting exposing per se, exposing in the old-fashioned word, the film, the look of it, what lights you're using, and again, all of that is what mood you're creating, all hopefully all in service of the story. None of it should be done really just like arbitrarily.
So informative. And then you come in for episode 6 as your first episode. When did your prep begin for this?
Um, we started prepping. They were already shooting when we started prepping. So I don't remember exactly. They might have been in episode
Oh,
4-ish,
wow.
something like that. We had about a month, I would say, of prep. Um, it's a very sort of interesting. I had never done this before. I knew the cinematographer Checo who did the first 5 episodes. I hadn't seen him for a long time, but he wasn't the reason that Nzinga was why I got brought in. But Checo's great. I ended up I had just come off another project in Canada, and I was sort of a bit tired. And so the production really wanted me to like absorb their crew if I could. And I actually did that and was super, super happy that I did because they were all the gaffer, the key grip, the whole camera department, they were all fantastic. And I think that also helped me with a little bit of, even though our episodes diverged a little bit, um, there was still some continuity that I was looking to maintain. But that was, so we would visit, I would talk to those people, and Zingwood and I would go on the set. We'd sort of just see what they were doing. But also knowing that like we wanted to go in a different direction not because we just wanted to, but because that's really what we felt the story demanded.
That actually, I mean, this is leading me straight into a question I really wanted to ask because there is a visual language that's established in the first 5 episodes of this show. But the script kind of, it's like another act of the story when we get to your episodes. It's really almost, it feels almost like a different show in the story that's being told because they're further into their lives, into their careers. So when you start approaching this, how much license do you have to put your own stamp on the episodes versus how much of the original visual language are you trying to retain?
That's a really interesting question. And I think that the thing I always say to people, and the thing that Nzinga and I talked about a little bit, there are certain things that were continuous from those episodes. I was using the same camera, obviously the same lenses, the same LUTs that Checo had used. So there's a continuity there. And then there's huge continuity that I think people don't necessarily even consider, but the continuity of the wardrobe, the actors' faces, some of the locations, all of those things provide such a kind of consistency that unless Nzinga and I went out and did something crazy, and out of left field, like, hey, let's shoot black and white or something, really like out there, I think that continuity would always be there because the truth is, like, I work differently from every other cinematographer. And so no matter what, even if I tried to copy, let's say, Checo's work, it's not going to do that. And the same thing with Nzinga. She's not going to copy another director's work because it's just not how it doesn't really, even if you wanted to. I mean, I've done it before working second unit, and it's quite a difficult skill when you have to like basically dissect another person's work. And even when you're trying to explain what you did, I've had stuff where other cinematographers have had to come in and like do additional photography on films I've shot and because I'm somewhere else, on another project, and I'm like, well, we sort of did this, and I'm like, well, how did you do? I'm like, I don't even know why. Just like this is sort of what it ended up looking like. It wasn't that was this is um, there's so much sort of subtlety and stuff in there. So I really think a lot of that continuity comes from everything that is already sort of established. But then I don't know if I'm jumping ahead on your questions, but then for us, it was really about breaking what they had done in the first block was really because it's the rise of the band and that the band is quite sort of naive and innocent for the most part. A lot of their stuff was much more formal camera work. In our episodes, as the band get big, our shots get bigger, but also as the sex and the drugs and all the chaos starts to happen, it really felt like our language wanted to devolve into much more aggressive, handheld camera work, much more intimate. Like we were very much like wider lenses and closer, really trying to get into like the actors, spaces. Um, so I hope I've answered that question, and maybe not. Maybe I went off
Yeah,
track
no,
there.
that's great. I think it's good to be in the because it's all part of the prep. It's you figuring out what is this supposed to look like, but it just inherently can't be the same no even if you tried. So,
Yeah.
I do want to get into the specific episodes, but one more general question for those who are just learning about what you do. What are some of the departments you work with the most in your job? Obviously, lighting and camera, but what are some of the touch points that are most frequent for you in the show?
Yeah. So beyond, you mean beyond the departments that basically that I'm in charge of? Yeah. So
Yeah.
then it really like this, there's a lot of interaction with obviously the production designer and their department because so much, I've always said that like 75% of good photography is good design, meaning what you put in front of the camera. So if you give me a great set, you give me great wardrobe, beautiful actor, beautiful faces of actors, you choose the right time of day to do things, my job becomes quite easy because I'm not, it's when the opposite. If you get sort of backed into like a set that maybe doesn't allow you to photograph it the right way, or you're just given, whatever it is, anything that just it doesn't look good on camera, or you're forced to shoot something in the wrong light, then the job becomes really difficult. So a lot of interaction with the production designer. I would say on this show, a little bit less with Jess Kender. She was amazing, but she had so much established already that it wasn't like if I'm on a film and I'm starting a project, then I really weigh in heavily on wall color and window treatments and all these things that affect the light, affect the way the light bounces off of a set and all that sort of stuff. But less so, in this case. But then the other departments are wardrobe and hair and makeup, and there's a lot of testing that goes on with wardrobe and the colors and shimmer and the same thing with makeup and hair. How is that stuff going to photograph? We do extensive testing. What looks good on who and what kind of light does works well with whether it's makeup, whether it's wardrobe, those sorts of things. So those are really the departments that I interact with the most.
Let's get into some of these episodes.
Mm.
This is just, I'm so excited to get into this. So in episode 6, whatever gets you through the night, we're going to see a huge shift in the Daisy and Billy dynamic. And up until this point, it's been mostly about the tension between them. In episode 5, we actually get to see them have a breakthrough when they write their first song together. And so it puts them on new ground going into your episodes. So now we're going to get to see a little bit more of what the collaboration side looks like with them. So, what are some of the things that you might have done from a technical standpoint to be able to mark this new point in their relationship or this new dimension to their relationship?
Um, yeah, that's a good question. It was sort of difficult on the one hand because we were in the a lot of our episode, if memory serves me, a lot of our episode was in the recording studio and then also in the parking lot outside, and that's where like these major like their first kiss and some of that stuff happens. Um, so to sort of mark that, it was more difficult because we were already in these spaces that had been established, and then that again that continuity of those existing locations. Um, but particularly for the kiss, I just remember we just wanted this like very kind of like this push in shot, this sort of very almost dramatic camera work, and then we really uh, played around with the flares. Like we dropped the camera really low and got the sun kind of like shining between them for this moment. And it had a real kind of like dynamism and aggression. And I think that was the sort of thing that was marking like, okay, this is what you've, up until this point, everything's been quite formal and sort of more, I don't mean traditional in a negative way. I just mean the camera was like more fluid and it was less abrupt and stuff. And here we were like, oh, let's do these sharper camera movements, almost like I just sort of think of them as being rougher in a way. Even if we were pushing it on a dolly, it was like we add a little like aggression to it, to really sort of like ramp up the kind of distinction between those. So that was sort of the kind of big thing we did initially to like get us into this new sort of language.
We're also going to see in this episode, because you're right, there are a lot of studio scenes, but we also get a bunch of outdoor scenes, especially in the first half of the episode, that are night scenes. Seemed like there was a lot of night shooting that was happening in this episode. I love the lighting in all of them. So there's one scene where Camilla comes downstairs in the middle of the night to find Billy in the yard on the phone having a private conversation with Daisy about the song Please. And we get this beautiful darkly lit scene. A lot of times for me when I'm watching shows that are trying to do shots that are reading for night, they end up being too dark and I can't make out what's happening. But for me, I feel like I was really able to distinguish what was going on in these scenes. So tell us a little bit about working on this scene or the night scenes in general for this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think night is one of the most, particularly moonlight. So moonlight, this it takes place. I don't. We shot it. It was a house it was either Echo Park or Silver Lake, and it was a beautiful location that was nearly impossible to get equipment in and out of. These windy, narrow streets up to it, narrow staircases that went all the way up this like terraced backyard. There was no lift access. So like traditionally, like, you'd sort of like, oh, maybe we bring some kind of a lift in and we bring moonlight in that way or something like that. Um, there was none of that. Now, fortunately, because it was a terraced backyard, we were sort of able to take lights up high on stands and kind of get them up, and the lights could be up on the top of the sort of terrace without sort of impeding our frame. So we were still able to get sort of high light sources. But moonlight I mean, you ask 10 cinematographers, and you get 10 different answers on what they think moonlight is, what it should look like. Um, and also, you'll get 10 different answers about how bright a scene should be. I definitely think there's a trend, certainly in the last 10 years, and I embrace it myself to a degree, where things just like get darker and darker and darker to the point where it's almost like, well, if I can't make it look, and this is not a criticism of other people, but it's like this thing where you're like, this doesn't look right. If something's not feeling, if it's feeling false in a way, because that's my sort of barometer. It's like I'm always looking at something. I'm like, if it looks false or lit, then I have to rethink it. I'm like, I don't want it to be artificial in a way that takes an audience out of what they're watching. So I'm always really conscious about my light sources. Um, but sometimes I think what happens is if you're not quite sure about something, you're like, okay, well, I'm just going to make it darker. And then you think that maybe solves your problem. But, it's a personal taste. I also know cinematographers, some of my favorite cinematographers, who I really respect and admire, have this ability to do real darkness, and yet it doesn't feel like I'm struggling. Like, and I don't know how they do it, but when I do it, I struggle. So I'm just trying to find the balance of like where it doesn't look fake, doesn't look lit, but also I can kind of see what's going on. And so in that scene, it was like, okay, there's no, we did one of this emotional thing of like, um, Camilla coming downstairs and seeing him and sort of wondering, and he's on the long phone cord. So we'd sort of designed, I don't even know if it made it. We had this kind of cool shot that comes off the cord and kind of pushes in towards Billy as he's got his back to her. And that was the whole thing. Like he's obviously doing something kind of clandestine that she's cut out of. So we wanted him sort of silhouetted in the moonlight with his back to her. So the scene's really about her reaction, and then putting her in a little bit of like, just sort of really beautiful, soft, underexposed moonlight. But it was tricky because he's on the outside and she's inside. So you end up having to like, even though it looks like it's all one source, you end up like having light for him. And then when you're doing her close up, it's like certain light. You need to like pick her out a little bit without doing the background. And it just becomes sometimes it becomes a bit fussy. I think that was one of those like slightly fussy scenes. But I do remember liking the way that turned out. And I'm usually like 50-50 about how I feel about moonlight scenes. But luckily that it was a case where the location did allow us to do, because that's the thing. It's like I want my moonlight to come from up high. I don't want it to feel like it's on a stand, just coming off out on the edge of frame and feeling artificial. So at least, even though we couldn't use lifts, it was nice that the location itself allowed that.
I mean, it's a stunning scene, and really the yard plays a lot. That we also see it in a conversation with Karen and Camilla over a fire pit, so that's another light source that you can use there. And like you said, there's the terrace. It looks like there's multiple levels to it. Although I don't know if
Mhm.
that's an optical illusion or if that's really what's happening there. So it sounds like it was a really complicated look. It seemed for some reason that terrace makes it feel like a very big space. But it sounds like it was
Which is
actually tighter
not.
quarters than
Yeah.
than it looked like to me. Even during daylight scenes, what were some of the other nuances of shooting in that location?
I mean, it was really all about what can we get in where and trying to minimize the amount of equipment. And, on a TV schedule, you just have much less time in general than you do on a film. And so you have to bang out a bunch of pages, and it's so difficult when you're trying to you're like, okay, we're going to shoot this scene now over here. And every piece of equipment that you needed for the previous scene that has nowhere to go is in the living room or the kitchen, right? And now we're done outside or we're done wherever. Now we have to get into the kitchen. Now we're going to shoot this scene in the kitchen. Everything that we have is in the kitchen. So now it's all got to move first. Then you come and you block the scene with the actors, and then you get to work and you to light the scene and that sort of stuff. It was limited windows for day scenes and for night scenes. I think mostly using practicals as much as possible. Not really bringing too much moonlight in the windows if I could help it. Trying to use like indoor practicals and stuff, lamps, and then you all meant those. But low ceilings because it was a practical location. So there's just limited places to hide. So you're really like trying to like everywhere you can. It's just like, okay, let's hide a light here. Let's stick something here, bounce a little something here into the ceiling, whatever we can do. And you sometimes you get shots that are great, and other times you're like you sort of feel like you're just sort of making do and like, okay, we this one's okay. I wish it could be better, but just the nature of you know the space and where the camera needs to be and where the what the actors' movements are, and then if the camera becomes more complicated, it limits those sorts of things. So it's really just the nature of like a very small space without movable walls and those things, which sometimes has its pluses. But I think that and the number of people when you start factoring in all the people that are on a film set in this very small location and just getting everyone up and down one set of stairs on the side of the house. That was the most difficult part.
Well, okay, so looking at another location, I guess would be the Chateau Marmont. Daisy jumps into a pool at a party in this episode, and we get this beautiful overhead shot of her sort of floating face up, and the camera pulls up. Um, how did you get this?
We had a techno crane. I mean, but it's a telescopic crane, so I think it was one of the smaller ones, meaning that they go up to like 70 feet. The one we had actually only goes to about 20 feet, but it's a much smaller base. So it was actually like an apartment complex in sort of in the hills at the base of the Hollywood Hills that doubled as the chateau. Um, so it was the only kind of crane that was the small enough one that we could get through the gates and then get up onto like the patio area around the pool. And we used it for a bunch of other shots, but that's all part of the kind of process of like you design these shots. Sometimes you design shots that are not possible and you have to rethink them. Other times you design shots that then I turn to like my crew, the grips and the electrics, and it's like, well, this is what we want to do. Can we do this? Is this possible? And then they think of what's the best way to achieve that.
Hmm. I think it comes out awesome. I don't feel like we see a shot like that quite so many times in this
Mm.
series. I don't know if you used that crane a whole lot for that particular application.
we definitely use that crane. I mean, I try to have that crane whenever we can because it's such a useful tool, not just for high shots, because it telescopes, it basically can replace a dolly and then you're not laying track. And so it can sort of do all kinds of great things. But it's expensive, so you can't always have it. And it doesn't fit in every, it's not something that you can have in every location depending on the size of it. But yeah, I mean, that was a big, you want to showcase the wardrobe. I mean, and Denise won an Emmy for the wardrobe for this show, um, deservedly so. So it was like, okay, we need to show, this amazing thing outfit in the water, and that, was like the way to do it. How else? We just wanted like, what's the kind of? I think this show probably more so than a lot of projects I've worked on. It felt like we were constantly looking for iconic images. Like, what is the iconic image of this scene? How do we make this really amazing graphic image, whether it's about wardrobe or whether it's just about the location or whether it's about, any number of things. And I think there were so many great locations that kind of allowed that combined with the fantastic wardrobe and the makeup and hair and all that stuff.
Hmm. Okay. Well, okay. So another, as far as I'm concerned, an iconic location is the photo shoot location, which my understanding is it was a bit torturous to be on set or on location that day in terms of the weather, which is probably really difficult for your team. Um, it looks like a really interesting space with a lot of features. How much latitude did you have over deciding what was going to be where and where the camera was going to be pointing?
I mean, a lot of latitude, and Zinga and I think that was probably the hardest location for us to find because there were a few other places that we liked as well, that were closer. And then every time we sort of kept thinking about this, because it was far, it was like probably an hour and a half away, which just becomes a cost thing because you have to we shot there for 2 days. So you have to put people up overnight. It sort of eats into your shoot day. So you're really making compromises on one hand. But again, going back to like what I was saying about design, it's like if you put the right stuff in front of the camera, that's so much more valuable than like the drive time, like saving the drive time and having another hour to shoot at a not great location just means you have more shots, but none of them look as good. So there's not really like, so what's the point? Like, and look, that's the sort of odd thing that the conversations you always get into with producers because they're like, well, you're only going to get 9 hours of shooting instead of 10 and a half or something. It's like, yeah, but 9 hours of great location is always going to be better than 10 and a half of bad locations. Um, so we did, we finally settled in that place because of the variety. There were so many moving pieces in that sequence. It's probably one of the sequences that scared me the most, not including like the concert stuff, but that sequence because there was so much to do and there were so many like scenes within scenes. It was like this character has a beat with this character. Now they walk over here, and now there's a scene with these other three characters, and then that continues, and now we follow this new character, not new to the story, but this person now goes over to it, and so on, and you're basically also doing this from sun up to sundown. So it's like, okay, light continuity, like I'm trying to balance that out. What scenes really should have the beautiful, like either early morning light or end of day light? What scenes are a bit more forgiving and you can do them in the middle of the day? And then, yeah, we spent a bunch of time like figuring out, okay, this is the spot where the photo shoot should be. This is where Billy needs to pull up, and this is where Daisy needs to be waiting for him. And so we really spent a lot of time mapping that out. So yeah, I mean, we had a lot of say. We basically we put stuff where we wanted it to be, based on what our needs were.
Hmm. Well, one of the things I really like about that whole sequence is that you had mentioned the kiss scene earlier with Billy and Daisy, and the way the camera goes in, and then you see the sun between them, and something about having sort of nature interrupting them in that kiss. It's called to mind again when we see them fighting a little bit
Mm.
later, even though you don't really see the sun in the same way, but something about being outside, sort of looking up at them and seeing sky behind them. I felt like there was this thread that tied all those scenes together for me that was really quite lovely. Um, but it's cool to know that this wasn't just about like this is how it was scripted, but that you actually found what you needed in the location and then shot accordingly.
Yeah, there was a lot of definitely a lot of reverse engineering in this one because it's all sort of open to interpretation. I mean, the other, it's funny you mentioned about that kiss or that because that was also another, it was like such an iconic image of, well, this has to go on an album cover, right? That was the idea was that Camila takes the picture that ends up as the album cover. So it's like, oh gosh, now we need to find like we're not just making, it's like it's one thing when you're like, well, this needs to be a good looking shot in our scene, so on and so forth. But now you need to find actually what's the environment that stands up enough that you would go, oh yeah, I buy that as an album cover. So that was like a really difficult kind of like, oh boy, we really got to get this beat right. Um, so that made that, also just added another layer to like the complexity of that whole sort of sequence. And the
Hmm.
wind, yeah, the wind was there was a lot of wind and dust, which, look, here's the thing, right? I've always said that I say this about rain and I say this about snow. There are elements that are tough to film in, but they look amazing. So I would take them every day of the week. I would rather be miserable and wet or cold or sand and dust. It's not great for the technicians, and I totally feel bad for them. Sometimes it's not great for the actors. I get that. They got sand blowing their faces. It's not great. But there's like a thing that happens that there's an overall sort of like, there's like an alchemy, there's a magic, there's something that happens as a texture that you get from the wind, like the wind blowing that, again, amazing shots of Riley in this incredible wardrobe and the wind is like snap blowing it. And you get these like memorable, iconic images that even if we brought fans up or not, you're not going to create that same kind of effect. So all of those elements, and I think like you said, there is that earthy, there's something about that that adds to this kind of, 70s Fleetwood Mac-esque, you get that, and you're out in like Joshua Tree and there's something about with the wind and all those elements that makes it feel a bit more kind of rooted in something that was, even though they're not a real band, you just really feel like there's kind of like there's some truth in there somewhere, from all those elements.
Yeah. One more question about this episode. We're gonna get filming the Regret Me song in the studio, the recording of it. There's so much sweeping movement in the studio for this song, and it is the last song that they're going to record to add to this album. So I guess it needs to be a big finish of sorts. Tell me about filming this particular song.
I'm not sure that I remember. I'm not sure
Yeah.
if I remember which one it is. Because the thing is, like, okay, so what happens is there are so many different songs going on in that environment, and that's part of the challenge is also like, well, how do we make each recording different, and what is the hook or the gimmick? And I'm not saying we did this, but sometimes you sort of get to a place where you're like, okay, this wants to be more of like a free flow and the camera's just going to move around. And we had this incredible Joseph Arena, our fantastic Steadicam operator who came, our eight-camera Steadicam operator who had done the first 5 episodes, and he was just incredible. And so he would put the Steadicam on. I mean, I'm totally not talking about the scene you're going to talk about, but there were some sequences where I remember we were shooting, and these weren't even musical performances. There were some sequences later where we were in like the backstage areas and stuff, and Joseph would put the Steadicam on, and I would sort of like I would be like, oh, the blocking's a bit different. I'm not quite sure. Like it's not exactly what Nzinga I talked about. And I'm like, I don't quite know what we're gonna do. And then he would put it on and he would start being like, well, I could start here and I would do this and so this and then he would just it would evolve into something and it would just keep going and it would become this great Steadicam shot that like was telling the story and doing it in this very efficient way. Now, this might have been one of those cases where I don't know if we had something else planned or we had different pieces, but there was to a degree an element of like just like unleashing Joseph. Where it's like, okay, we're just going to take off the shackles here. Just go. Shoot something cool. And I guess that is where you, as you said earlier, that is where you actually kind of go back to some of your music video roots where you're like, okay, we're going to cover this scene and try to get these cool pieces. And then editorial will, put something together. Um, I so there might have been some elements to that. I kind of just I don't unfortunately I don't specifically remember that track or like what we did in that scene. So that's sort of
Yeah.
my best answer. Sorry.
No, that's perfect. That's great. I mean, let's look at episode 8, which is looks like we made it. We're going to start getting Daisy Jones and the Six on tour in these huge arenas to these sold out crowds. Of course, with that premise and with COVID, there's going to be some visual effects that are added in later to make these stadiums feel the way they are supposed to feel. So, how are you shooting these concert scenes to allow for what will inevitably have to be done in post?
Well, you so on a technical side, we often what you do, there's sort of two sides of it. There's the side where you imagine the shots as if they were full of crowds. So, you're shooting a big wide shot going, well, this looks stupid right now, but it's going to be amazing when VFX adds those elements in. And they add, we on a lot of those days, we would have maybe 100 to 200 people. That was sort of our limit. I think it was our COVID limit and our budget limit. This was all like, I think we were sort of spring of 22, and all of those concerts were in New Orleans. All those, the stages and we did stages, arenas, and then ultimately the stadium was like the final concert. Um, and then, often depending on the shots, if you're on stage and now you're photographing the actors, you're over the actors to the crowd, often that requires blue screen and then multiple passes of crowd members. We didn't really do very much blue screen. I mean, luckily our VFX team was sort of like, no, I think we can roto all this. And so we had very little blue screen, which is great because that can be very, very time consuming. So the sort of technical elements are like, yeah, I mean, you're framing shots and thinking about where they're, I've done movies with like, CG monsters and things, and it's always this conversation where you're framing a shot. Often I'm having to talk to the camera operators because they're framing a perfect shot of the actor running, and you're like, you've been trained and this is great. You've got this perfect shot, but like, don't forget, there's a monster chasing this person that you don't see right now, but the audience will, and it'll be there. So you've got to imagine that your frame needs to allow for the space. And they're always like, oh, right. I always forget about that. So there's a little bit of that where you have to go, okay, there's going to be giant crowds in these shots. So let's, so those are sort of the technical, there's the creative side of it and the technical side of, of just making sure that you're actually leaving enough space later for in these shots so that they can put these massive crowds in, that you
Hmm.
don't forget that like, oh yeah, we need those things. But it was really, I think, sort of what I was saying before, like what we really tried to do was just in all the performances, it was a combination of like, we want these really, really massive wide shots that show the scope, but then the rest of it wants to be up on stage and intimate. So we're in the actors' faces and we're seeing the performances. And then, yeah, you do shots from behind to connect the two where you feel you feel that performer, but you also feel the whole crowd that they're like, performing too.
Yeah. In contrast to that, what was it like filming in these tight quarters of these buses for those bus scenes?
Yeah, those were tough. The bus scenes were tough, like super limiting. Um, and things don't really move very well. I mean, sometimes we'd have to take seats out, take things out. That would take a long time. Um, there were a few really intimate. There was like one intimate scene between Billy and Daisy that was, like there was the camera operator and then Zinga and you know, Sam and Riley, and that's it. In the back of the bus, doing like these super intimate scenes. And then we'd sort of do a little bit of a block or rehearsal before, and I'd like maybe tweak a little light. Sometimes I would just go in there and do lighting or tweaking myself because it was just like less people. You just don't want. So yeah, it was, those scenes were difficult. But then there's the scenes where there's like 25 people in the bus, and you're shooting two cameras. A lot of those were poor man's, meaning that we were just like on a stage. And actually, most of them I don't think that we were even driving. So the buses are supposed to be parked. So, you're kind of just imagining a little bit of light coming in from outside, and then yeah, you're just wherever you can, you're fighting to hide lights. And, we used a lot of atmosphere, a lot of smoke for that period feeling, and just, again, adding texture and giving it that smoky feeling, which sometimes, does help with lighting because you can kind of do less lights and the smoke, the atmosphere will actually dig into the shadows a little bit. So you don't feel like, oh, I have to add a light for every little dark corner.
Mm.
But yeah, it was tough. Those were not my favorite days.
Yeah. Let's talk about the press conference scene. It plays with a lot of chaos, scripted and in the way it's portrayed. So I think a lot of that feeling gets captured with these quick cuts, these in the edit process that we get. But there's also a lot of camera flashes that are happening and, like a lot of different camera angles. So how did you approach this scene?
Yeah, we definitely sort of we actually shot, so it's interesting because for the most part we shoot most of the show on prime lenses, which are fixed focal length. So it's like a 35 millimeter or it's a 75 millimeter, whatever, but that's the lens. There were a couple of scenes, and this was one of them that we shot on zoom lenses, specifically so we could get a bit more of that kind of press conference feel of like snap zooms. We wanted the operators to be able to kind of zoom in. I think we might have even, like, there were some days we did three cameras, and I think this was one of our three camera days. We wanted it to be very hectic and feeling like this sort of chaotic. And I think what doesn't, if I'm not mistaken, I don't remember, but I think we did a lot of like whip pans as well, but I don't think they actually make the cut as much. But we wanted like somebody to ask, like a reporter would ask a question, then we wanted the camera to whip to like Billy or Daisy or whoever, and then it would whip to another person, or it would whip to like one actor in the foreground, and then we'd rack to another actor. We wanted to just have this constant like chaos. And then, like as you say, yeah, the flash bulbs provide a little bit of sort of tension there as well. So it really wanted to be this kind of like, oh, the band is fighting, there's tension, there's chaos. How do we create this? And to give it like a bit of a like a 70s, that sort of, zooms are quite synonymous with the 70s. So we wanted to have that sort of feeling of a press conference, and B, this kind of 70s thing, with the chaos. So that our approach was very much like three cameras, lots of camera stuff happening, zooms, whips, and just chaos.
Hmm. There are so many concert scenes in this episode. And it's like you see another intertitle come up on the screen. It's like a new city, like, but of course, from a show standpoint, from the Daisy Jones and the Six show, it's supposed to be consistent from city to city, but for the characters, their relationships are evolving. Their state of substance use is evolving as the sequence goes on. So, what are some of the things you're doing here to try to distinguish between these concerts versus, what needs to stay the same?
Mm. Yeah, that was the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge on the whole show was by far the concerts. It was the progression of the concerts and our goal of kind of making them be as authentic, as possible. Um, and then how do we have to scale them up. And so we really had three levels. We had like what we thought of as stage performances, where they were more like in theaters, and those are like the first ones. And then it evolves into the arenas. And I think we probably shot at two or three stages to basically be all the stages, but those are more specific. And then we get to the arenas. I think we only had two arenas that basically substituted for all the arenas. And so a lot of those changes are through, again, what you see in terms of wardrobe and the actors, and then what visual effects does to change the environment. Then there's only one sequence that takes place at the one stadium. So that was its own thing as well. But the thing for us was like in designing the lighting for these things, the first thing was we wanted them to be authentic. So we wanted them to be period accurate, which meant basically old, we didn't want to be using any modern light fixtures. Now we did have some, we cheated some that we hide, like movers and stuff, but we didn't want any lights that moved because they didn't do that back in those days. And we didn't want any lights that would be changing color themselves because they also wouldn't do that, you know? So everything had to be, we basically had hundreds and hundreds of par cans with old school gel on them, but we wanted a progression. So when we started in the stages, it was a smaller, and then, but the other thing we did was we basically designed a sort of color palette for each song and a kind of a pattern and a rhythm to each we programmed. So we actually brought in the gaffer Nick Cutt, was his idea. And it was a great idea. He was like, we need to bring in some professionals because we're all movie lighting people and we know about sort of concert lighting, but we need to bring in people who do this who do this on a more regular basis. So we brought in additional like concert lighting specialists to help us design the lighting because we wanted there to be energy and we wanted the lights to be going off and on and different colors to go through different songs, but they had to do it in the way that they would have done it, back in the 70s. We even one of our lighting programmers even reached out to the original like lighting designer on the Fleetwood Mac tours back in the 70s to ask him about what did he do, what did he, what were like the sort of like color palettes they worked in, and how many lights were they usually doing, and how complicated were their shows. I watched a ton of like old, clips on YouTube of like old concerts and like what were they. So each song we ended up like creating a palette for, and then we sort of stuck with that palette. So for continuity's sake, it was like, well, if they were on tour, that's what they would do. Like Regret Me would be one thing, and I just can't even think of another song, but another song would be everything would have its own thing.
Yeah, so like the
Um,
river, yeah.
exactly. And then so we would pick palettes, like we'd pick something might be blue and gold, something might be red and orange, something might be, and I think we also wanted to limit the palette to be much more like what they would use there. So we basically stuck to like five colors of blue and yellow and orange and red. And I think maybe it was like a lavender. I said no green. I was like, I don't want any green anywhere. So we didn't have that. We just kept with those more what felt right based on what the stuff I had kind of looked at. But each time they go to a new venue, it would be the same color palette, but there would be more lights. It would be a larger scale. When you start on the stages, it's really just a few rows of par cans up behind them. Obviously there's like spotlights from the front, but in terms of stage lighting that you see, and you get to the arena, and now you've got more banks of lights. And by the time you get to the stadium, it's just banks and banks of lights, and the scale of it is much bigger than anything that they've done before.
Hmm. Let's talk about Nikki and Daisy partying in their suite. What
Okay.
an interesting scene in
Oh yeah,
terms of
one of my
camera.
favorites.
It
Yeah.
seems like anything goes here in terms of how you shoot this. We're seeing a lot of styles that we don't normally get to see. There's a lot of blurred focus. There's a lot of angles. I don't know if I'd call them Dutch angles or if they're just angles. There's
Yeah.
bottles in the foreground. There's so much happening here. How much of this was just trying ideas out on the day versus like how much of this was scripted and intentional in the writing of it?
I don't know how much of it was scripted per se, but certainly, I mean, it was obviously scripted that they're going into a sort of drug-induced fever or whatever's happening, and like she's out of control, or they're both out of control. And he's obviously a bad influence to say the least. Um, so that's clearly very scripted. I think in terms of how we shot it, it's not really dictated in the script. Oh, you must, use Dutch angles and you must blur. But certainly that was what Nzinga and I had talked about, how to interpret this and how do we create. We wanted the audience to really be in that headspace of like that trippy, drug fueled, like you're just not in control. So that was always sort of planned. Now, there's definitely a little trial and error on the day. There's probably lots of shots that are cut out that don't make that sequence. And, you try certain things. But yeah, wanted to have that, we really, it was like Nzinga let the actors go. We had a couple of cameras, and sometimes we'd only be able to do one camera because we really wanted to get up in their faces. And it was like, we just kept encouraging them to, kept encouraging the actors to kind of go, sorry, kept encouraging the operators to go with the flow of the actors of like, let's, get us those sort of, Dutch angles, those and roll the camera as you're going, and let's have focus drift in and out, and let's push the camera in on an actor and bring them into focus and then take them back out of focus as you lean out, and just make it as sort of as destabilizing and kind of like trippy as we could do. I do think that's one of the best sort of sequences, that and then his and Billy's discovery of her. I think that whole sort of sequence is one of my favorite things.
Yeah, it's so good, especially, as I was going through with a careful eye to this so I could decide what questions I wanted to ask you. I was like, oh, this is amazing. And I guess a cousin of that is when we open up the next episode, episode 9, feels like the first time. We get the sort of blurry effects of Daisy waking up after her OD from the previous episode. How did you get this?
It might have been my memory again fading a little bit, but I think it was, we had a tool called a lens baby, which is just a very specific sort of lens, and it's based on an old-fashioned like still photography kind of technique, or a piece of equipment that you put on, and it essentially blurs. It was either that or it was like a swing and tilt lens, and I don't remember exactly which one. But they're basically, they were lenses that were designed for still cameras, and lots of people have used them in movies, but they allow you to shift. You're either shifting the focal plane in a way that does things that you're not used to. So that's how you get these like unconventional focus effects. Or it'll do a thing like with the lens babe where it can blur the whole outside of the image, and it leaves you just a very selective portion of the frame that's in focus.
I think
Um,
that happened. Yeah, that little ladder, I think, is an effect that I saw. But if you looked back on it,
yeah,
you might say, Melissa, you're wrong. But I was like, what's
it's,
happening? Because parts of the frame would be blurry, but not all of it.
yeah.
Really
So
interesting.
special pieces, just specific lenses that allow you to, again, you have to have a reason for doing that. We had a very good reason. It's like her disorientation and all that. But there are those kinds of things that like, and by the way, back in my music video days, we used to take, when you couldn't afford that, you would take a glass filter and then you would rub Vaseline around the corners, around the outside of the lens, and it would basically do the same. You could get a very similar effect. Um, so there are like, other
Your
techniques.
tricks.
So you just the same kind of what's great about those tools like the lens baby and is that you can then adjust them while in camera you can make adjustments and things to those focal planes.
Well, it's good because it's, in the previous episode with their partying, we certainly saw a lot of tricks being used to disorient us, but this one is another trick, but feels a little different than the ones that we saw in the previous episode. And I think it needs to because it's a different situation. And so that it captured it well. I don't know if this will be something that you have recall for, but the song "It Was Always You," which is a song that Daisy sings to Billy. It's a very unfinished just thought of a song that she sings to Billy in the lobby of a hotel. I'm not sure where they are. They must be in the lobby of a hotel or like a private sitting area in a hotel. It's a lot very lit with a lot of windows around them, but they're in a private space. It's shot in this really intimate way. They just had a meal at like a burger joint where they got recognized by their waitress, and he's like, "Oh, have you
Oh,
thought of any
yes, yes,
songs?" And she's like, "No." Well,
yes,
yeah. And he's like, "Check, please." And they go. And so she's singing this
yes.
song that's clearly written about him. And they're at this point where she can sing it straight to his face and it's not weird, and it's just so intimate. What do you remember about shooting this one?
Yeah, so that was supposed to be, I think it was supposed to be her suite, like a portion of her suite. I think
My
they're in like her
goodness.
hotel. I think that's what it was supposed to be, like her hotel room. And it was some beautiful space in some beautiful hotel in New Orleans. I don't remember exactly which one. Um, what I remember about it was it had the most exquisite, beautiful, like natural soft light coming through the whole bank of windows, which is my favorite thing. And like I didn't have to do much else. Like that's one of those things where you're like, okay, plop the actors in the right places. You put the camera and the actors in relationship to the lights in the right places, and then you need very little else. Um, I remember them. Yeah, I sort of remember they quite enjoyed that scene. I think because they quite enjoyed having this sort of intimate scene with not a lot of other characters, and just the sort of chance for them to like be able to play those notes and those beats and it be a sort of emotional scene, but a subtle scene compared to so many scenes that they have to do together that are like, either it's this or it's like it's just extreme passion on one end is either, passion, good passion, or it's, you know, bad passion if there's such a thing. But so often they were like playing those scenes that like required such heavy lifting, whereas this was a much more subtle scene. And I think that I sort of played the scene in the same way where I was like, well, let's let it just be this very, naturally, simply lit scene. And I think we played quite long shots. Do you remember like we set up some dolly shots where we just really slowly dollied in on the two, like we'd slowly dolly in on Riley the whole time as she's performing. And we do the same thing on Sam where it would be like, oh, we're just gonna like be focused in on his reaction. But yeah, I remember like enjoying like the sort of a piece of it maybe, the
It is
peacefulness of the scene.
peaceful. Yeah, there's something
Yeah.
really, there's just a different quality to that. There's so many songs in the show, but that one feels different. It's a love song sung directly to the person, and we just don't get a lot of that here. Um, so in terms of just like iconic images, episode 10, Rock and Roll Suicide, the band gets on stage and we see this silhouette of Daisy spreading her wings in that white dress. It's one of the best and most recognizable images of the show for me. How much was this specific shot like scripted or planned versus, was this something where there were a lot of variations? I mean, I feel like wardrobe is critical to this happening.
The wardrobe is the champ. Denise was the champ. Um, and it was not scripted. I don't think that particular image was scripted per se. I think it was just Denise had this idea for like the wings on the thing. And then, I mean, we probably thought a little bit about it. And at a certain point, I mean, we are always going to shoot shots from all those performances have shots from behind. But I think that was one of those ones where, whether or not we were like, okay, we have to shoot this shot, or whether or not we were just setting up for another image, and then that became like the iconic image of the whole show, you know. Um, but yeah, you just have to like acknowledge that the wardrobe was so incredible that again, you have that put that in front of camera, it's like, okay, so the only choice to make is like, do you front light it or do you backlight it? And it was like, well, you backlight it, and that's what it stood up to, and then it became this, incredible image. Um, but it was not like something that was, yeah, like, oh, she's going to be standing there. I mean, maybe I'm doing the script a disservice because maybe it wasn't there, but I kind of don't remember specifically that it was written out like that.
Yeah, magic, absolute magic. This episode is structured a bit differently. It feels like it's structured differently, where we're going to see all these different vignettes of
Mhm.
what happened to the various band members before their final show. Um, how does this change your approach to shooting this episode as a whole and the concert itself when you know it's going to be structured like this?
It doesn't really change. The only thing it changes because we still shoot the whole concert in one go. You know what I mean? I don't mean like one go, like one long take. I just mean that like we go and we shoot for 2 or 3 days, whatever it is, and we just shoot all the scenes and all the beats. The only thing that really changes is that you sort of know like, well, where are the ins and the outs? And it's like, okay, we know this. And so sometimes when you can, you try to design transitions in between. I don't know if we ended up doing that well or had that time, but you know, you also need to be careful not to necessarily lock in editorial because even though it's scripted a certain way, it's like sometimes those pieces could get shuffled around. So it's a balance because you're like, oh, we want to come off the beer bottle that Billy's having in the bar and cut to the beer bottle. I think maybe we did. I think we did one gag like that, maybe. Although that might have been an earlier concert. But you think about like, well, we want to come from this beer bottle to this stage now that we're back on the thing. But then if the editors decide, and they can always cut out, they can be like, well, we're not going to use the beer bottle. But it doesn't really change too much the way we shoot because we're still, we're doing a whole sequence, and then we go to the bar and we shoot all the stuff with Billy in the bar, and then we go to the lobby and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So, look, if you were to like go to the dictionary and look up the word desire, right? There, I think the clip of Daisy and Billy singing, well, yeah, you could pick a couple clips from this concert, right? But I think More Fun to Miss really
Oh yeah.
sticks out to me a lot. And some people may say the later song where they're like practically kissing as they're singing, but for me, the More Fun to Miss, um, something about them like face to face, but like, and then the sweat, it's just a lot. Tell us about filming this. Clearly, you were like going for some different vibes on a couple of these songs. Um, and clearly Sam and Riley were given different directives on it. But how do you shoot this to make it feel so distinct?
A lot of it is really just trying to sometimes you're not even necessarily trying to make it distinct, and then what gets it to be distinct is the freedom that the actors have. So a lot of the things that we did were handheld, these sequences. But it really, I think those particular ones, it was like it's about being as intimate as you can be with the performers. So it isn't sort of like what I mentioned in the beginning. We don't want shots that are on really long lenses from the back of the back of the auditorium over the heads of crowd members, and seeing the band members up there. What you want is to be on stage, and you want to be over Daisy to Billy, and over Billy to Daisy. You want to connect them. You want to connect them in the shots so that they're not isolated. Like you physically connect them in the shots, and then you want to be handheld and up close so that it feels more real and authentic. And then the closer you are, like an audience doesn't know, like most people, 99% of most people don't know, oh, they're using a wide lens closer. Like they're on a 35 mil, 2 feet from the actors, as opposed to, oh, I see they're on a 135 mil and they're 10 feet from the actors. They don't know that, but they feel the difference. Like you feel the presence. You just like feel like you're more standing up on stage with those performers than you do the longer the lens. So that was really how we wanted to make these scenes. And there are there are other scenes that do play a little bit longer. As an example, like when you have to trim this. I'm trying to think of Karen and then
Graham
Billy's
and Graham.
great. Right. So the scenes between Graham and Karen, because they're so distant from one another, and we don't know why until we discover why, but we shot their interactions specifically on longer lenses to make them feel further away and to make them feel more isolated. And then we didn't necessarily shoot them in the same frame, meaning we weren't shooting over the shoulders. It was like, oh, this is Graham's perspective of Karen, and she's way over there. And now Karen looks at Graham, and he's way over there, and there's nothing between them. So those things kind of highlight, the way that like the camera can help you, how you feel about a certain sequence or how you relate to certain characters.
There's there after this, well, right after this concert, Daisy and Billy are making out backstage, um, and there's this
Oh,
blue
these are
light.
my favorite shot. Yeah. Sorry,
Yeah,
go ahead.
it's a because the blue light is coming from the backdrop that was on the stage. It's pouring that light back, that filter back onto their scene. Um, so I guess you were just working with this anyway, but talk to me about shooting this and like what the significance of that. You might have had options because I don't think it's just a straight blue backdrop. I think there might have been a little orange in it, and um,
Well,
so
yeah.
what
So,
was this about?
well, it was, we had multiple backstage scenes. And that backdrop, when you walked back there and we were walking around, it was like, this is gorgeous from the backside. You can just imagine, I could immediately imagine them silhouetted and it would become this iconic image. It's probably my favorite image of the show is them, one of my favorite images, the two of them, the wide sort of shot backstage and them silhouetted against that. It's just, we're literally on the backside of their main, their, whatever you call it, the backdrop that, and so ordinarily, when you're on the other side and they're performing, you're front lighting that backdrop to the audience, and that's what it looks like. When you go on the backside, now all that light, and we might have, I don't remember if all backings, I don't remember if it was a conscious choice, if we requested it, or if it was already, like I would have requested a sort of translucent backdrop for that very reason. Now, maybe it always was going to come like that. I kind of don't remember if there was a discussion about it or it was always going to be that. But you want to give yourself those opportunities. But we did have to augment like their light. We like had some lights that we sort of hid, or they were up out of the frame to kind of just help rim them a little bit from that backdrop. And then when you come in for close-ups, like on most things, you then have to you augment even a little bit more to kind of make it a bit prettier on the actors' faces.
Hmm.
But yeah, those are probably my favorite image was them against that backdrop back
Yeah,
then.
oh,
Yeah.
it's gorgeous. And then one maybe small technical question, but the we're gonna get like some at the end of this episode some sort of picture in picture footage where we're going to see we finally see Julia, who is the interviewer, and she's
Mm.
going to show Billy footage from Camilla's interview, and we're looking at the palm site interview, the interview on from that screen. Um, is there anything technical that you needed to consider with this? Was that actually playing or was that somehow added in post?
I believe it was playing, but I don't know. It could have been augmented later. No, you know what? It probably wasn't playing. It probably wasn't playing because we may not even shot all those interviews. It's possible that we hadn't shot them, or it's possible that they weren't edited in a way. Yeah, so I doubt that they were actually practically playing. So they were probably just staring at like a blank
A blank palm
thing.
site.
But we didn't record. There was a very specific, we had a lot of discussions in prep because we shot all the interviews. So even though the interviews appear all the way through, we ended up shooting all the interviews in our block. And there were a lot of discussions, maybe more than about anything else, discussions about how to shoot these interviews and what they should be. Should the characters be looking at the camera? Should they be looking off camera? Should this be letterbox? Should it be 4:3 and look like? Should we shoot it on a camcorder, or should we shoot it with our motion picture cameras? We had all of these discussions, um, and I mean, I kind of think in the end we probably chose the most watered down version of like safety first. Oh, we'll shoot it with our cameras and we can always change it later and make it more. But I'm sort of a big fan of like if we want it to be this camcordery look, let's just do that. But ultimately, that's not what they. I think there were a lot of different opinions about what it should be. So I think we just kind of like, well, we'll make it this. But I think that yeah, I don't know that they quite resonated as much as they maybe could have. I don't know that they felt as authentic as they could have, I guess. That's my one sort of nagging regret about how we shot some of those interviews.
Interesting. Well, okay, so I mean, those are my episode related questions, but just a few general things. Like you've worked on a lot of shows and movies, so what stands out to you as the difference in the process of this show?
Versus the other things I've worked on.
Yeah, what's something that is like that was a distinctly Daisy Jones and the Six experience for you?
Oh, well, I think, okay, so there's a few things. One would be the sheer volume of pages that you have to read and learn, because when you're doing a movie, it's at most 120-page script, Doing Daisy Jones, where you got 4 episodes of 60 pages, you're at 240 pages, and you have not nearly as much prep time, and you're sort of like you're reading one script and you're prepping that, and then the next script comes in or revisions for 3 episodes down the road, and so it's just like it's a lot to kind of process. Um, a lot of so there's I mean there's multiple different ways TV goes because there's the version where what we did, where it's like a one director and DP do a block, and then another director and DP do a block, almost like two big movies, you know. There's the version where two cinematographers alternate every episode, and then different directors come in for almost every episode, but then they prep. So while one cinematographer and crew are shooting, the other crew is prepping with the new director, and they just keep leapfrogging. Or there's the version where they one cinematographer and director do the entire thing, which is much more like a limited series, and that's a lot of pages. Um, I think the oh, I'll tell you what. Okay, so this is great because I'll tell you what was so distinct to this show, and I haven't really done any other musical shows, but but compared to was that these actors were like a real band. So they, first of almost none of them, with the exception of maybe Riley, had any musical background, right? So, and maybe you know all this, but they all did like, and Frankie probably talked a bunch about this, but they all did like boot camp and learned their instruments and did all that stuff, and they were tremendous. But and this is not a bad thing. They also started acting like a band. So when we would come and we'd be trying to rehearse, we'd be trying to block scenes, and we'd be in the recording studio, we'd be up on the stage. Like they would just be jamming, practicing and jamming, especially Warren, and he would just be like drumming and drumming and going to a point where it'd be like, dude, you gotta stop. Like this is we go to the ADs, we just see that, and then they would get annoyed, but there was like they almost took on, and they were so close, all of them, that they took on this like feeling of a band, and it was actually genuinely lovely to see. Even though sometimes it was annoying as fuck that they would like just jam out and like, set stuff up.
They were really
Um,
trying to think right now. Can we
yeah,
just get 5 minutes?
but other than like some actors normally leave the set and they're like, well, they just want to go back to their trailers, but they all just wanted to jam for the most part, and there was like this bond between them, and I think because they had all been together for so long, particularly if you add in boot camp, but then you add in the months and months of shooting 10 episodes, but that was like a really distinct thing, and also the songs were so great. Like it was a joy to like shoot those, to photograph those actors. I mean, they're all so beautiful that like it's great to like have these beautiful faces and the beautiful wardrobe, but then to have them performing and it to feel like a real band, um, was a real like privilege in a way. And even things like sort of designing, like when we be with all the people that helped it, we'd be doing the lights. I remember we had this moment of like putting up we were showing in Zynga and the producers, we had just sort of built all the cues for um, the final stadium concert. And so it was like the night before or a couple of nights before, and we were going to show in Zynga what we had designed and all this stuff. And she was there, everyone was there watching. I don't think the actors were there. Um, and we would play the songs and run all the things. And then and Zinga like started crying. She had tears in her eyes because she was so like moved by it all. And I was like, oh, this is pretty cool. Like everyone was so ecstatic, and it just felt like such a sort of achievement and combined with the music. So that was pretty special. Like I don't know that you get that on too many shows. So I
Mm,
do like really value that experience and
yeah.
that about my show.
So good. There are a number of names that have come up for you a lot in the course of answering the questions that I asked you today. But are there any who are some of the unsung heroes, maybe people that you haven't had a chance to drop their name, but you really want to make sure that you shout them out and that we know what their contribution was to this project?
I mean, obviously, I've already talked about like people like Denise and wardrobe, that sort of stuff. And I mentioned Joseph Arena, the operator. I think I mentioned Nick Cutt, but I would say the two people for me would be Nicholas Cutt, who was the gaffer on the show. And I don't know what I would have done without him. I mean, he was like the driving force of like how we're going to tackle these concerts when I was sort of like, I don't know, man, this is like pretty big. I don't even know where to begin. He was like, well, let's get we need to get somebody in who can help us. We'll start step by step. We'll do this. He wrangled all of that and just drove that. So I don't know how I would have done that would have done without him. And then also Rick Stribling, the key grip, who also who'd done the first 5 episodes and who just managed all the camera support, all the cranes, all the giant rags, all the things that like the key grip does. And the two of them being like the sort of greatest gentlemen and always being cheerful, even when my spirits were often dampened. They were still the ones who were like, this is going to be great. We're going to do this and it's going to be all right. So it's really, I think, I'm so grateful to have had met them and had them on the show.
Thank you so much for taking all of
Oh,
this time. For somebody like when we started this, you're like, I don't know how much I'll remember. And I think it's fair to say you remember a lot. And I'm glad that I caught you now while it's all still in there. And
I
this
forgot a
has
lot
just
too,
been
though.
such a blast. But is there anything that you're that you any projects? I know it's been a very strange time in your industry. Are there any other projects that you want to plug? Maybe things coming up or things you've recently put out or things long past? However you want to answer that. Tell us what you want us to go watch.
Oh, the only thing I would talk about is that I have a movie, Predator Badlands, coming out in November of this year. So that's a movie I shot in New Zealand last year with the same director that I did Prey on. I think it's going to be super crazy fun. I know people say people you hear this all the time. People are like, "Oh, we're doing another movie in a franchise or whatever," but this one's going to be different. We're going to do something different that people haven't seen before. People say that all the time, but it's not really the case. That is the case here. It is not like any other Predator movie. It's crazy out there. Um, I don't know whether people like it. I think we'll see, but it's definitely going to be a wild ride. So people can look for that. The trailer will be out in next month in May 2nd. I think.
Okay, amazing. And this may drop after that, but if it has, go back and check it
Sure.
out. Or actually, the trailer would be dropping, so it would still be sometime
Yes.
before the release. So be on the alert. That's the
Yeah, yeah.
project you need to check out, everybody. But thank you so much, Jeff, for taking all this time and talking with me, talking with all of us about the show.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm so happy to be here and discuss it all. It's been super
And
fun.
oh, it was so good. And to everybody who's watching this, go out there, don't be the muse, be the somebody. Bye, everybody.